Today we're going to talk about Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes who's also known as Guido Fawkes, was fighting for the Spanish. Was a member of a group of provincial English Catholics involved in the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, which resulted in his death and him being hanged and quartered. Now he was born and educated in York. His father died when Fawkes was 8 years old, after which his mother married a recusant Catholic. Now, Fawkes converted to Catholicism and left for mainland Europe, where he fought for the Catholic Spain in the 80-year War. 80 Years' War, basically. There was a war that went on for 80 years, off and on, against Protestant Dutch reformers in the Low Countries. He traveled to Spain to seek support for a Catholic rebellion in England without success, but he would later meet Thomas Wintour, with whom he returned to England. Now, Wintour introduced him to Robert Catesby, who planned to assassinate King James I and to restore a Catholic monarch to the throne. Now, the plotters had leased an undercroft beneath the House of Lords, and Fawkes was placed in charge of the gunpowder that they stockpiled there. Now, the authorities were prompted by an anonymous letter to search Westminster Palace during the early hours of November 5th, and they found Fawkes guarding the explosives. Now, he was questioned and tortured over the next few days and confessed to wanting to blow up the House of Lords. Now, now Fawkes was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. However, at his execution on January 31st, he died when his neck was snapped. As he was hanged, with some sources claiming that he deliberately jumped to make this happen. He thus avoided the agony of his sentence. He became synonymous with the gunpowder plot, the failure of which has been commemorated in the UK as Guy Fawkes Night since November 5th of 1605, with his effigy when his effigy is traditionally burned on a bonfire, commonly accompanied by fireworks. Now, Guy Fawkes was born in 1570 in Stonegate, York. He was the second of four children born to Edward Fawkes I Proctor, and an advocate of the consistency of the consistory court at York, and his wife Edith. Now, Guy's parents were regular the communion people at the Church of England, as were his paternal grandparents, and his grandmother, born Ellen Harrington, was the daughter of a prominent merchant who served as Lord Mayor of York in 1536. Guy's mother's family were recusant Catholics, and his cousin Richard Cowling became a Jesuit priest. Now, Guy was an uncommon name for somebody in England, but may have been popular in York on account of a local notable Sir Guy Fairfax Easton. Now, the date of Fawkes' birth is unknown, but he was baptized in the Church of St. Michael Le Belfray in York on April 16th. Now, as the customary gap between birth and baptism was 3 days, he was probably born on the 13th of April. In 1568, Edith had given birth to a daughter named Anne, but the child died about 2 months after it was born in November of that year. She bore two more children after Guy, Anne, born in 1572, and Elizabeth, born in 1575. Both were born in 1599 and 1594, respectively. In 1579, when Guy was 8 years old, his father ended up dying, but his mother remarried several years later to the Catholic Denis Bainbridge of Scotton Harrogate. Now, Fawkes may have been a Catholic throughout the Bainbridge's family's recusant tendencies, and also the Catholic branches of the Pullion and Percy families of Scotland, but also from his time at St. Peter's School in York. A governor of the school had spent about 20 years in prison for recusancy, and its headmaster, John Pullion, came from a family of noted Yorkshire recusants, the Pullions of Blubber Houses. Now, Now, in her 1915 book, The Polians of Yorkshire, author Catherine Polin suggested that Fawkes's Catholic education came from his Harrington relatives, who were known for harboring priests, one of whom later accompanied Fawkes to Flanders in 1592. Fawkes's fellow students included John Wright as his brother and his brother Christopher. Both later were involved with Fawkes in the gunpowder plot. And Oswald Tesman, Edward Oldcorn, and Robert Middleton, who became priests, the latter being executed in 1601. After leaving school, Fawkes entered the service of Anthony Brown, the first Viscount Montague. The Viscount took a dislike to Fawkes and after a short time dismissed him, but he was subsequently employed by Anthony Maria Brown, second Viscount Montague, who succeeded his grandfather at the age of 18. At least one source claims that Fawkes married and had a son, but no known contemporary account can confirm this. In October of 1591, Fawkes sold the estate in Clifton in New York, that he had inherited from his father. He traveled to the continent to fight in the 80 Years' War for Catholic Spain against the new Dutch Republic, and from 1595 until the Peace of Bourbons in 1598 in France. Now, although England was not by then engaged in land operations against Spain, but the two countries were still at war, and the attempted invasion of England, led by the Spanish Armada in 1588, was only 5 years in the past. He joined Sir William Stanley, an English Catholic and veteran commander in his mid-40s, who had raised an army in Ireland to fight in Leicester's expedition to the Netherlands. Stanley had been held in high regard by Elizabeth I, but following his surrender of Devonshire to the Spanish in 1587, he and most of the troops had switched sides to serve Spain. Now, Fawkes became an alferez, or also known as a junior officer, that fought well at the siege of Calais in 1596, and by 1603, he had been recommended for a captaincy position. That year, he traveled to Spain to seek support for a Catholic rebellion in England, and he used the occasion to adopt the Italian version of his name Guido, and in his memorandum described James I, who became King of England that year, as a heretic who intended to have all of the Papist sect driven out of England. He denounced Scotland and the king's favorites among the Scottish nobles, writing it will not be possible to reconcile these two nations, as they are for very long. Although he was received politely, the court of Philip III was unwilling to offer him any support whatsoever. These are all the people who were involved in the gunpowder plot assassination, and Guy Fawkes is the guy in the middle. Like right here, if you see where my finger is pointing, that would be him. Yep. In 1604, Fawkes became involved with a small group of English Catholics led by Robert Catesby, who planned to assassinate the Protestant King James and replace him with his daughter, who was third in line of succession, at the time Princess Elizabeth. Now, Fawkes was described by the Jesuit priest and former school friend Oswald Tesman as a pleasant of approach and cheerful of manner, opposed to quarrels and strife. He was loyal to his friends. Tesman also claimed Fawkes was a man highly skilled in matters of war, and that it was his mixture of piety and professionalism that endeared him to his fellow conspirators. The author, Antonia Fraser, describes Fawkes as a tall, powerfully built man with thick reddish-brown hair, a flowing mustache in the tradition of the time, and a bushy reddish-brown beard, and that he was a man of action, capable of intelligent arguments as well as physical endurance, and somewhat to the surprise of his enemies. Let me go back here. Now, the first meeting of the 5 central conspirators took place on Sunday, May 20th of 1604, at an inn called the Duck and Drake in the fashionable Strand district of London, England. Catesby had already proposed at an earlier meeting with Thomas Wintour and John Wright to kill the king and his government by blowing up the Parliament House with gunpowder. Now, Wintour also, who at first objected to the plan, was convinced by Catesby to travel to the continent to seek help. Now, Wintour had met with the Constable of Castile, the exiled Welsh spy, the Welsh spy Hugh Owen, and Sir William Stanley, who said that Catesby would receive no support from Spain. Owen did, however, introduce Winter to Fawkes, who had by then been away from England for many years and thus was largely unknown in the country. Now, Winter and Fawkes were contemporaries. Each was militant and had first-hand experience and had first-hand experience of the unwillingness of the Spaniards to help. Now, Wintour had told Fawkes of their plan to do somewhat in England if the peace with Spain helped us or not. And thus, in April of 1604, the two men returned to England. And Wintour's news did not surprise Catesby, despite positive noises from the Spanish authorities, and he feared that the deeds would not be answered. One of the conspirators, Thomas Percy, was appointed as a gentleman pensioner in June of 1604, gaining access to a house in London that belonged to John Wynyard, keeper of the King's Wardrobe. Now, Fawkes was installed as a caretaker and began using the pseudonym John Johnston as a servant to Percy. The contemporaneous account of the prosecution, taken from Thomas Winter's confession, claimed that the conspirators attempted to dig a tunnel from beneath Wynyard's house to the Parliament, although this story may have been a government fabrication, and no evidence for the existence of a tunnel was presented by the prosecution, and no trace of one has ever been found. Fawkes himself did not admit the existence of such a scheme until his fifth interrogation, but even then, he could not locate the tunnel. Now let's say if the story is true, however, by December of 1604, the conspirators were busy tunneling from their rented house to the House of Lords. They ceased their efforts when, during tunneling, they heard a noise from above. Now, Fawkes was sent out to investigate and returned with the news that the tenant's window was clearing out a nearby undercroft directly beneath the House of Lords. So that plan would fail. The plotters purchased the lease to the room, which also belonged to John Wynyard, which was unused and filthy. It was considered an ideal hiding place for the gunpowder that the plotters planned to store there. According to Fawkes, 20 barrels of gunpowder were brought in at first, followed by 16 more on July 20th. On July 28th, however, the ever-present threats of the plague delayed the opening of Parliament until Tuesday the 5th of November. In an attempt to gain foreign support in May of 1605, Fawkes traveled overseas and informed Hugh Owen of the plotters' plan, and at some point during this trip, his name made its way to the files of Robert Cecil, who was the first Earl of Salisbury, who employed a network of spies across Europe. One of these spies, Captain William Turner, may have been responsible, although the information he provided to Salisbury usually amounted to no more than a vague pattern of invasion reports and included nothing which regarded the gunpowder plot on April 21st. He told how Fawkes was to be brought by Chesapeake to England. Now, Fawkes was a well-known Flemish mercenary and would be introduced to Mr. Catesby and honorable friends of the nobility and others who would have arms and horses in readiness. Turner's report did not, however, mention Fawkes' pseudonym in England. And John Johnston did not reach Cecil until late November, well after the plot had been discovered. It's uncertain when Fawkes returned to England, but he was back in London by late August of 1605, when he and Winter discovered that the gunpowder stored in the undercroft had decayed and it became useless. Now, more gunpowder was brought into the room along with firewoods to conceal it. Now, Fawkes' final role in the plot was settled during a series of meetings in October, and he was to light the fuse and then escape across the Thames. Simultaneously, a revolt in the Midlands would help to ensure the capture of Princess Elizabeth. Acts of regicide genocide, basically genocide, were frowned upon, and Fawkes would therefore head to the continent, where he would explain to the Catholic powers his holy duty to kill the king and his retinue. Let's see here. Okay, here we go. So a few of the conspirators who were concealed about fellow Catholics would be present at Parliament during the opening. On the evening of October 26th, Lord Monteagle had received an anonymous letter warning him to stay away and to retire yourself into your country where you may expect the event in safety, for they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament. Now, despite quickly becoming aware of the letter, informed by one of Monteagle's servants, the conspirators resolved to continue with their plans, as it appeared that it was clearly thought to be a hoax, and people didn't believe that this was actually on the thing here. Here's a picture of the discovery of the gunpowder plot of a painting, 1823, by Henry Briggs. Now, Fawkes would check the undercroft on October 30th and replaced it, not gay at all. I don't care that you're gay, Audie. If you like sucking dick, that's your choice. I don't need to know about it. And that basically nothing had been disturbed. Now, Monteagle's suspicions had been aroused, however, and the letter was shown to King James. Now, the king ordered Sir Thomas Combet to conduct a search of the cellars underneath the Parliament, which he did in the early hours. Don't have Down syndrome at all. My IQ is higher than yours, Audie. So and I'm not surprised to say that, because I have a higher IQ and I had a better college education than you did. And it does not surprise me that you have Down syndrome because of your inbreeding. Now, Fawkes had taken up his station late on the previous night, armed with a slow match and a watch given to him by Percy, because he should know how the time went away. And he was found to leave in the cellar shortly after midnight and arrested inside. The barrels of gunpowder were discovered hidden under piles of firewood and coal. Now, back then, the methods of torture were extreme. Now, Fawkes gave his name as John Johnston and was first interrogated by members of the king's privy chamber, where he remained defiant. When asked by one of the lords what he was doing in possession of so much gunpowder, Fawkes answered that his intention was to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. He identified himself as a 36-year-old Catholic from Netherdale in Yorkshire, and gave his father's name as Thomas and his mother's name as Edith Jackson. Wounds on his body were noted by his questioners, explained as the effects of pleurisy. Now, Fawkes admitted his intention to blow up the House of Lords and expressed regret of his failure to do so. His steadfast manner impressed King James, who described Fawkes as possessing a Roman resolution. Now, James's respect did not, however, prevent him from ordering on November 6th that John Johnston be tortured to reveal the names of his co-conspirators. He directed that the torture be light at first, referring to the use of manacles, but more severely, if necessary, authorizing the use of the rack. The gentler tortures are to be first used until him, and so by degrees proceeding to be the worse. Now, Fawkes was transferred to the Tower of London. The king composed a list of questions to be put to Johnston, such as to what he is, for I can never yet hear of any man that knows him. Because that was like a fake name he was using, when and where he learned to speak French, and if he was a papist who brought him up in it. The room in which Fawkes was interrogated subsequently became known as the Guy Fawkes room. Now, here is a signing. This is supposed to be Fawkes' signature using the name Guido, made soon after his torture, as a barely evident scrawl compared to a letter instance 8 days after the torture. Now, Sir William Wadd, lieutenant of the Tower, supervised the torture and obtained Fawkes' confession. He searched his prisoner and found a letter addressed to Guy Fawkes. To Wadd's surprise, Johnson remained silent, revealing nothing about the plot or its authors. On the night of November 6th, he spoke with Wadd, who reported to Salisbury. Johnson, told us that since he undertook this action, he did every day pray to God that he might perform that which might be for the advancement of the Catholic faith and saving his own soul. According to Wadd, Fawkes managed to rest through the night, despite his being warned that he would be interrogated until he had gotten the inward secret of his thoughts and all of his accomplices. His composure was broken at some point during the following day. Now, the observer, Edward Hobie, remarked, since Johnson's being in the Tower, he beginneth to speak English. Fawkes revealed his true identity on November 7th and told his interrogators that there were 5 people involved in the plot to kill the king. He began to reveal their names on November 8th and told how they intended to place Princess Elizabeth on the throne, but his third confession, on November 9th, implicated Francis Tresham following the Ridolfi plots of 1571. Prisoners were made to dictate their confessions before copying and signing them if they still could, although it is uncertain if he was tortured on the rack. Fawkes' scrawled signature suggests the suffering he endured at the hands of his interrogators. Here's a picture of Guy Fawkes' public execution in November during a 1606 sketching. And you can see that here. Kind of hard to really see where it's actually at. So yeah, you can see that there. So the trial of 8 of the plotters began on Monday, January 27th of 1606. Now, Fawkes shared the barge from the Tower to Westminster Hall with 7 of his co-conspirators, and they were kept in the Star Chamber before being taken to Westminster Hall, where they were displayed on a purpose-built scaffold. The king and his close family, watching in secret, were among the spectators as the Lords Commissioners read out the list of charges for each person. Fawkes was identified as Guido, otherwise called Guido Johnson. He pleaded not guilty, despite his apparent acceptance of guilt from the moment he was captured. Now, the jury found all the defendants guilty, and the Lord Chief Justice, Sir John Popham, pronounced them guilty of high treason. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, had told the court that each of the condemned would be drawn backwards to their death. By a horse, his head near the ground, and they were to be put to death halfway between heaven and earth, as unworthy of both. Their genitals would be cut off and burnt before their eyes, and their bowels and hearts removed. They would then be decapitated, and the dismembered parts of the bodies displayed so that they might become prey for the fowls of the air. That's how gruesome they were back then in England. Now, Fawkes and Tresham's testimony regarding the Spanish treason was read aloud, as well as confessions related specifically to the gunpowder plot. Now, the last piece of evidence offered was a conversation between Fawkes and Wintour, who had been kept in adjacent cells. The 2 men apparently thought they had been speaking in private, but their conversation was intercepted by a government spy. When the prisoners were allowed to speak, Fawkes explained his not guilty plea as ignorance of certain aspects of the indictment. On January 31st of 1606, Fawkes and 3 others, Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, were dragged from the Tower on wattled hurdles to the Old Palace Yard at Westminster, opposite the building that they had attempted to destroy. His fellow plotters were then hanged and quartered, and Fawkes was the last to stand in the scaffold. He asked for forgiveness of the king and state, while keeping up his crosses and idle ceremonies. Catholic practices, weakened by fortune and aided by the hangman, Fawkes began to climb the ladder to the noose, but either through jumping to his death or climbing too high, so the rope was incorrectly set. He managed to avoid the agony of the latter part of his execution by having his neck broken. His lifeless body was nevertheless quartered, and as well as the custom, his body parts were then distributed to the 4 corners of the kingdom to be displayed as a warning threat to other would-be traitors of the country. On November 5th of 1605, Londoners were encouraged to celebrate the king's escape from assassination by lightning bonfires, provided that this testimony of joy be carefully done without any danger or disorder. An act of Parliament designated each November 5th day as a day of thanksgiving for the joyful day of deliverance, and it would remain in force until 1859. And Fawkes was one of 13 conspirators, but he is the one individual that most people associate with the gunpowder plot. In Britain, on November 5th, he was has been in Britain, November 5th has variously been called Guy Fawkes Night, Guy Fawkes' Day, Plot Night, and Bonfire Night, which can be traced directly back to the original celebration of November 5th of 1605. Bonfires were accompanied by fireworks from the 1650s onwards, and it became custom after 1673 to burn an effigy, usually of the Pope, when the heir presumptive James, Duke of York, converted to Catholicism. Effigies of other notable figures have found their way onto the bonfires, such as Paul Kruger, Margaret Thatcher, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and Vladimir Putin. Now the guy is normally created by children from old clothes, newspapers, and a mask. During the 19th century, Guy came to mean an oddly depressed dressed person, while in many places his lost its pejorative connotation, and instead refers to any male person, or in a plural form can refer to people of any gender, as in you guys. Now, James Sharp, professor of history at the University of York, has described how Guy Fawkes came to be toasted as the last man to enter Parliament with honest intentions. William Harrison's Ainsworth's 1841 historical romance Guy Fawkes, or The Gunpowder Treason, portrays Fawkes in a generally sympathetic light, and his novel transformed Fawkes into the public perception into an acceptable fictional character. But Fawkes subsequently appeared as essentially an action hero in children's books and penny dreadfuls such as The Boyhood Days of Guy Fawkes or The Conspirators of Old London, published around 1905. According to the historian Lewis Call, Fawkes is now a major icon in modern political culture, whose face has become a potentially powerful instrument for the articulation of postmortem anarchism in the late 20th century, and Fawkes is regarded by some as a martyr, political rebel, or freedom fighter, especially amongst a minority of Catholics in the United States, in the United Kingdom, basically, too. So here, you have the gunpowder plot. This is more in depth of the gunpowder plot. So you can see the story back then. The newspapers were kind of different back then, too. There's different names for it. So gunpowder plot of 1605 in earlier centuries, often called the gunpowder treason plot, or also it was referred to as the Jesuit treason, was an unsuccessful attempted regicide against King James the Fourth of Scotland and one of England by a group of English Catholics that were led by Robert Catesby. Now the plan was to blow up the House of Lords, and during the state opening of Parliament on Tuesday, November 5th of 1605. As the prelude to a popular revolt in the Midlands, during which King James's 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth was to be installed as the new head of state. Catesby is suspected by historians to have embarked on the scheme after hopes of greater religious tolerance under James had faded, leaving many English Catholics disappointed. Guy Fawkes' fellow conspirators were John and Christopher Wright, Robert and Thomas Winter, Thomas Percy, Guy Fawkes, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, John Grant, Ambrose Rookwood, Sir Everard Digby, and Francis Tresham. Fawkes, who had spent 10 years of military experience fighting in the Spanish Netherlands and the failed suppression of the Dutch revolt, was put in charge of the explosives and keeping an eye on it. Now, on October 26 of 1605, an anonymous letter of warning was sent to William Parker, who was the 4th Baron Monteagle, a Catholic member of Parliament, who immediately showed it to the authorities. Now, during a search of the House of Lords on the evening of November 4th, Fawkes was discovered guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder, and enough to reduce the House of Lords to rubble, and he was arrested. Hearing upon the plot that had been discovered, most of the conspirators fled from London while trying to enlist support along the way. Now, several made a lost stand against the pursuing Sheriff of Worcester and a posse of his men at Holbesh House. In the ensuing gunfight, Catesby was one of those shot and killed. And after their trial on January 27th of 1606, 8 of the surviving conspirators, including Fawkes, were convicted and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Now, some details of the assassination attempt were allegedly known by the principal Jesuit of England, Henry Garnet. Although Garnet was convicted of high treason and put to death, doubt had been cast on how much he really knew as the plot's existence were revealed to him through confession. Now, Garnett was prevented from informing the authorities by the absolute confidentiality of the confessional. Basically, when you confess to a priest, whatever you tell the priest cannot leave the communal thing. Although anti-Catholic legislation was introduced soon after the discovery of the plot, many important and loyal Catholics remained in high office during the rest of King James I's reign. The thwarting of the gunpowder plot was commemorated for many years afterwards by special sermons and other public events such as the ringing of church bells, which evolved into the British variant of Bonfire Night as we know today. And here's a picture of the person that they wanted to put in as queen. This is Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled England from 1558 to 1603. Between 1532 and 1540, King Henry VIII took control of the English Church from Rome, the start of several decades of religious tension in England. English Catholics struggled in a society dominated by the newly separate and increasingly Protestant Church of England. Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, responded to the growing religious divide by introducing the Elizabethan religious settlement, which required anyone appointed to a public or church office to swear allegiance to the monarch as head of the church and state. Now, the penalty for refusal was severe. Fines were imposed for recusancy, and repeat offenders risked imprisonment and execution. Catholicism became marginalized, and its adherents shrank to remote areas that were far from London. Despite the threat of torture or execution, priests continued to practice their faith in secret. Queen Elizabeth never married and never had any kids, but steadfastly refused to name an heir. Many Catholics believed that her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the legitimate heir to the English throne, but she was executed for treason in 1587. The English Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, negotiated secretly with Mary's son and successor, King James VI of Scotland, in the months before Elizabeth's death. On March 24th of 1603, Cecil had prepared the way for James to succeed her. Now, some exiled Catholics favored Philip II of Spain's daughter Isabella as Elizabeth's successor, but more moderate Catholics looked to James and Elizabeth's cousin Arbella Stuart, a woman thought to have Catholic sympathies. Now, as Elizabeth's health deteriorated, the government detained those that they considered to be the principal papists, and the Privy Council grew so worried that Arbella Stuart was moved closer to London to prevent her from being kidnapped by papists. Now, despite competing claims to the English throne, the transition of power following Elizabeth's death went smoothly. James's succession was announced by a proclamation from Cecil on March 24th, which was generally celebrated, leading papists rather than causing trouble as anticipated, and reacted to the news by offering their enthusiastic support for the new monarch. Jesuit priests, whose presence in England was punishable by death, also demonstrated the support for James, who was widely believed to embody the natural order of things. James ordered a ceasefire in the conflict with Spain, and even though the two countries were still technically at war, King Philip III sent his envoy, Don Juan de Tassis, to congratulate James on his succession. Now, for decades, the English had lived under a monarch who refused to provide an heir, but James arrived at the family and clear line of succession. His wife, Anne of Denmark, was the daughter of King Frederick II of Denmark. Their oldest child, the 9-year-old Henry, was considered a handsome and competent boy, and their two younger children, Elizabeth and Charles, were proof that James was able to provide heirs to continue the Protestant monarchy. King James's attitude towards the Catholics was more moderate than that of his predecessor, perhaps even tolerant. He swore that he would not persecute any that will be quiet and give an outward obedience to the law, but he believed that exile was a better solution than capital punishment. I would be glad to have both their heads and their bodies separated from this whole island and transported beyond seas. But some Catholics believed that the martyrdom of James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, would encourage James to convert to the Catholic faith, and the Catholic houses of Europe may also have shared that hope. Now, James received an envoy from Albert VII, ruler of the remaining Catholic territories in the Netherlands after 30 years of war and the Dutch revolt by English-supported Protestant rebels. Now, for the Catholic expatriates engaged in that struggle, the restoration by force of Catholic monarchy was an intriguing possibility, but following the failed Spanish invasion of England in 1588, the papacy had taken a longer-term view on the return of a Catholic monarch to the English throne. Now, during King James I's reign in the European wars of religion, it was very intensifying. Now, Protestants and Catholics were engaged in violent persecution of each other across Europe following the Protestant Reformation. Now, Catholics made several assassination attempts on Protestant rulers in Europe and in England, including plans to poison King James I's predecessor, Elizabeth I. In 1589, during the French Wars of Religion, the French king Henry III was mortally wounded with a dagger by Jacques Clement, a fanatic member of the Catholic League of France. 9 years later, the Jesuit Juan de Marianos on 1599 on Kings and the Education of Kings argued in support of tyrannicide. Now, this work recounted the assassination of Henry III and argued for the legal right to overthrow a tyrant, perhaps due in part to the publication of De Rege. Until the 1620s, some English Catholics believed that regicide was justifiable to remove tyrants from power. Much of the rather nervous political writing from James I was concerned with the threat of Catholic assassination and repudiation of the Catholic argument that faith did not need to be kept with heretics. Okay, let me go write this down. Okay. Excuse me 1 minute. I'll write down some notes. Okay, there we go. So, in the absence of any sign that James would move to end the persecution of Catholics, as some had hoped for, several members of the clergy, including 2 anti-Jesuit priests, decided to take matters into his own hands in what became known as the Bye plot. The priests William Watson and William Clark planned to kidnap James and hold him in the Tower of London until he agreed to be more tolerant towards the Catholics. So we'll put that down too. The Bye plot, which is BYE. Yeah, you learn a lot of different shit every day. Stuff that I never knew, like in history stuff, like stuff that I never even knew took place. Because when I did history class in school, that we didn't cover everything in history, but we covered things like World War I, World War II, Civil War, the French and Indian War, shit like that. We covered all that shit. But this stuff, like the gunpowder plot, was never covered in my class. Now, Cecil had received news of the plot from several sources, including the archpriest George Blackwell, who instructed his priest to have no part in any such scheme. At about the same time, Lord Cobham, Lord Grey de Wilton, Griffin Markham, and Walter Raleigh had hatched what became known as the main plot, which involved removing James and his family and supplanting them with Arbella Stewart, James's first cousin. Amongst others, they approached Philip III of Spain for funding, but were unsuccessful. All those involved in both plots were arrested in July and tried in autumn of 1603. George Brooke was executed, but James who was chained not to have too bloody a start to his reign, reprieved Cobham, Grey, and Markham while they were at the scaffold. Raleigh, who had watched while his colleagues sweated, had been due to be executed a few days later, but was also pardoned at the last minute. Arbella Stewart denied any knowledge of the main plot. However, the two priests, Watson and Clark, condemned and very bloodily handled, were executed. The Catholic community responded to news of these plots with shock. The by-plot revealed by Catholics was instrumental in saving them from further persecution, and James was grateful enough to allow pardons for those recusants who sued for them, as well as postponing payment of their fines for a whole year. On February 19th of 1604, shortly after he discovered that his wife Queen Anne had been sent a rosary from Pope Clement the Eighth by one of James's spies. Sir Anthony Standen, James denounced the Catholic Church. 3 days later, he ordered all Jesuits and other Catholic priests to leave the country and reimposed a collection of fines for recusancy. Now, James changed his focus from the anxieties of English Catholics to the establishment of an Anglo-Scottish union. He also appointed Scottish nobles such as George Home to his court, which proved unpopular with the Parliament of England. Some members of Parliament made it clear that, in their view, the affluxion of people from the northern parts was unwelcome, and that compared them to plants which were transported from barren ground into a more fertile one. Even more discontent resulted when the king allowed his Scottish nobles to collect their recusancy fines, and there were 5,560 convicted of recusancy in 1605, of which 112 of them were landowners. The very few Catholics of great wealth who refused to attend services at their parish church were fined $20 per month. Now, those of more moderate means had to pay 2/3 of their annual rental income. Middle-class recusants were fined 1 shilling a week, although the collection of all these fines was haphazard and negligent. And when James came to power, almost $5,000 a year, equivalent to almost $12 million in today's dollars, was raised by these fines. The gunpowder plot. I'm not a pedophile. I'm not a Trump supporter. So no. Today is about Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot. Basically, the gunpowder plot was a failed attempt to kill King James I. On March 19th, the king gave his opening speech to his first English Parliament, in which he spoke of the desire to secure peace, but only by profession of the true religion. He also spoke of a Christian union and reiterated his desire to avoid religious persecution. Now, for the Catholics, the king's speech made it clear that they were not to increase their number and strength in his kingdom, but that they might be in hope to erect their religion again. To John Gerald, those words were almost certainly responsible for the heightened levels of persecution of the members of his faith who are now suffering. And for the priest Oswald Teseman, they were a repudiation of the early claims that the king had made, upon which the papists had built their hopes. A week after James's speech, Edmund Lord Sheffield informed the king of over 900 recusants that were brought before before they brought these people called the Azizes in Normandy. And on April 24th, the Popish Recusant Act of 1605 was introduced in Parliament, which threatened to outlaw all English followers of the Catholic Church. Now, here's a picture of Queen Elizabeth again. Oh, shit. I'll go back to that. Right here. That's Queen Elizabeth I. That's King James's daughter, whom the conspirators plan to install on the throne as a Catholic queen. And this is a portrait by Robert Peake the Elder at the National Maritime Museum, wherever the fuck that is. That might be England. Now, the conspirators' principal aim was to kill King James, but many other important targets will be present at the state opening of Parliament, including the monarch's nearest relatives and members of the Privy Council, the senior judges of the English legal system, most of the Protestant aristocracy, and the bishops of the Church of England would all have attended in their capacity as members of the House of Lords, along with the members of the House of Commons. Another important objective was the kidnapping of the king's daughter Elizabeth. Housed at Coombe Abbey near Coventry, she lived only 10 miles north of Warwick, which was convenient for the plotters, most of whom lived in the Midlands. And once the king and his parliament were dead, the plotters would intend to install Elizabeth on the English throne as a titular queen. The fate of her brothers Henry and Charles would be improvised, but their role in state ceremonies was yet to be uncertain. The plotters planned to use Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, as Elizabeth's regent, but most likely they never informed him of this. Now, Robert Catesby, a man of ancient, historic, and distinguished lineage, was the inspiration behind the gunpowder plot. He was described by contemporaries as a good-looking man, about 6 feet tall, which was tall back then for a man. He was a good swordsman, which he knew how to use a sword, along with several other conspirators, and he took part in the Essex Rebellion in 1601, during which he was wounded and captured, but Queen Elizabeth allowed him to escape with his life after finding him 4,000 marks, equivalent to more than $6 million in today's money, after which he sold his estate in Chaston. Let's go back here. In 1603, Catesby helped to organize a mission to the new King of Spain, Philip III, urging Philip to launch an invasion attempt on England, which they assured him would be well supported, particularly by the English Catholics. Thomas Winter was chosen as the emissary, but the Spanish king, although sympathetic to the plight of Catholics in England, was intent on making peace with King James. Winter had also attempted to convince the Spanish envoy Don Juan de Tassis that 3,000 Catholics were ready and waiting to support such an invasion, and concern was voiced by Pope Clement VIII that using violence to achieve a restoration of Catholic power in England would result in the destruction of those that remained. Now, according to contemporary accounts, in February of 1604, Catesby invited Thomas Winter to his house in Lambeth, where they discussed Catesby's plan to reestablish Catholicism in England by blowing up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament. Now, Winter was known as a competent scholar. He was able to speak at least 8 different languages, and he had fought with the English army in Netherlands. His uncle, Francis Ingleby, had been executed for being a Catholic priest in 1586, and Winter later converted to Catholicism. Also present at the meeting was John Wright, a devout Catholic said to be one of the best swordsmen of his day, a man who had taken part with Catesby in the Earl of Essex's rebellion 3 years earlier. Despite his reservations over the possible repercussions, should the attempt fail, Winter agreed to join the conspiracy, and perhaps persuaded by Catesby's rhetoric, let us give the attempt, and where it faileth, pass no further. Now, Winter traveled to Flanders to inquire about Spanish support. Now, while there, he sought out Guy Fawkes, a committed Catholic who had served as a soldier in the southern Netherlands under the command of William Stanley, and in 1603 had been recommended for a captaincy. Accompanied by John Wright's brother Christopher, Fawkes had also been a member of the 1603 delegation to the Spanish court pleading for an invasion of England. Now, Winter told Fawkes that some good friends of his wished his company in England, and that certain gentlemen were upon a resolution due to somewhat in England, if the peace with Spain helped us or not. The two men returned to England late in April 1604, telling Catesby that Spanish support was unlikely due to Thomas Percy, Catesby's friend and John Wright's brother-in-law, were introduced to the plot several weeks later. Now, Percy had found employment with his kinsman, the Earl of Northumberland, and by 1596 was his agent for the family's northern estates. About 1600 to 1601, he served with his patron in the Low Countries. At some point during Northumberland's command in the Low Countries, Percy became his agent in his communications with James I. Now, Percy was reputedly a serious character who had converted to the Catholic faith. His early years were, according to a Catholic source, marked by a tendency to rely on his sword and personal courage. Northumberland, although not a Catholic himself, planned to build a strong relationship with James I in order to better the prospects of English Catholics and to reduce the family disgrace caused by his cousin's separation from his wife Martha Wright, a favorite of Elizabeth I. Now Thomas Percy's meetings with James seemed to go well, but Percy returned with promises of support for the Catholics, and Northumberland believed that James would go so far as to allow mass in private houses so as to not cause any public offense. Percy, keen to improve his standing, went even further, claiming that the future king would guarantee the safety of English Catholics. Now, the first meeting between the five conspirators took place on May 20th of 1604, probably at the Duck and Drake Inn, just off the Strand, Thomas Winter's unusual residence when staying in London. Catesby, Thomas Winter, and John Wright were in attendance, joined by Guy Fawkes and Thomas Percy. Alone in a private room, the five plotters swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book. By coincidence and ignorant of the plot, John Gerald, a friend of Catesby, was celebrating Mass in another room, and the five men subsequently received the Eucharist. Now, the adjournment of Parliament gave the conspirators, they thought, until February of 1605 to finalize their plans. On June 9th of 1604, Percy's patron, the Earl of Northumberland, appointed him to the band of gentlemen pensioners and mounted troop of 50 bodyguards to the king. This role gave Percy reason to seek a base in London on a small property near the Prince's Chamber owned by Henry Ferrers. A tenant of John Wynyard was chosen. Now, Percy arranged for the use of the house through Northumberland's agents, Dudley Carleton and John Hippisley, and Fawkes, using the pseudonym John Johnston, took charge of the building, posing as Percy's servant. Now the building was occupied by Scottish commissioners that were appointed by the king to consider his plans for the unification of England and Scotland. So the plotters hired Catesby's lodgings in Lambeth and on the opposite bank of the Thames, from where they stored their gunpowder and the other supplies could be conveniently rowed across each night. Now, meanwhile, King James I continued with his policies against the Catholics, and Parliament pushed through anti-Catholic legislation until its adjournment on July 7th. Now, following their oath, the plotters left London and returned to their homes. The conspirators returned to London in October 1604 when Robert Keyes, who was a desperate man, ruined and indebted, was admitted to the group. His responsibility was to take charge of Catesby's house in Lambeth, where the gunpowder and other supplies were to be stored, but Keyes' family had notable connections. His wife's employer was the Catholic Lord Mordaunt. He was tall, with a red beard, and was seen as trustworthy and like Fawkes, capable of looking after himself. In December, Catesby recruited his servant Thomas Bates into the plot after the latter accidentally became aware of it. Hold on here. So here you got the House of Lords. At the top here you see the House of Lords. That little red mark is the House of Lords. It's not a big place, but the House of Lords highlighted in red on John Rocque's 1746 map of London. Within the old Palace of Westminster, the River Thames is to the right. And then down here at the bottom is an early 19th century illustration of the east end of the Prince's Chamber, extreme left, and the east wall of the House of Lords in the center. So it was announced It was announced on December 24th of 1604 that the scheduled February reopening of the Parliament would be delayed. Concern over the plague meant that rather than sitting in February, as the plotters had originally planned for Parliament, would not sit again until October 3rd of 1605. The contemporaneous account of the prosecution claimed that during this delay, the conspirators were digging a tunnel beneath the Parliament, and this may have been a government fabrication, as no such evidence for the existence of a tunnel was ever presented by the prosecution, and no trace of a tunnel has ever been found underneath the house. The account of a tunnel comes directly from Thomas Winter's confession. And Guy Fawkes did not admit the existence of such a scheme until his fifth interrogation. Logistically, digging a tunnel would have proved extremely difficult, especially as none of the conspirators had any experience with mining. If the story is true, by December 6th of 1604, the Scottish commissioners had finished their work, and the conspirators were busy tunneling from their rented house to the House of Lords. They ceased their efforts when, during tunneling, they said they heard a noise from above, and the noise turned out to be the then tenant's widow, who was clearing out the undercrop directly beneath the House of Lords, and that was the room where the plotters eventually stored the gunpowder. Now, by the time the plotters reconvened at the start of the Old Style New Year on Lady Day, and there actually is a holiday called Lady Day. Not sure. I could look that up and see what that's about. On March 25th of 1605, three more had been admitted to their ranks: Robert Winter, John Grant, and Christopher Wright. The additions of Winter and Wright were obvious choices. Along with a small fortune, Robert Winter inherited Huntington Court, a known refuge for priests near Worcester, and was reputedly a generous and well-liked man. He was a devout Catholic. He married Gertrude, the daughter of John Talbot of Grafton, from a prominent Worcestershire family of recusants. Now, Christopher Wright, John's brother, had also been taking part in the Earl of Essex's revolt and had moved his family to Twigmore in Lincolnshire, then known as something of a haven for priests. John Grant was married to Winter's sister Dorothy and was lord of the manor of Norbrook near Stratford upon Avon. Reputed to be an intelligent, thoughtful man, he sheltered Catholics at his home at Snitterfield, and was another who had been involved in the Essex Revolt of 1601. In addition, on March 25th was the day on which the plotters purchased a lease to the undercroft that they supposedly had tunneled near to, owned by John Wynyard. The Palace of Westminster in the early 17th century was a warning. Yes, that's another thing too. I did mention earlier that the gunpowder became decayed, and if it sits too long, then it won't properly go off right. Now the Palace of the Palace of Westminster in the early 17th century was a warren of buildings clustered around the medieval chambers, chapels, and halls of the former royal palace that housed both Parliament and the various royal law courts. Now, the old palace was easily accessible. Merchants, lawyers, and others had lived and worked in the lodgings, shops, and taverns within its precincts. Wynyard's building was along a right angle to the House of Lords, alongside a passageway called Parliament Palace, which itself led to the Parliament Stairs and the River Thames. Undercrofts were common features at the time, used to house a variety of materials, including food and firewood. Wynyard's undercroft on the ground floor was directly beneath the first floor House of Lords, and may once have been part of the palace's medieval kitchen. Unused and filthy, its location was ideal for what the group planned to do. Now, in the second week of June, Catesby met in London the principal Jesuit in England, Henry Garnet, and he asked him about the morality of entering into an undertaking which might involve the destruction of the innocent together with the guilty. Now, Garnet was answered that such actions could be excused, but according to his own account later, admonished Catesby during the second meeting in July in Essex, showing him a letter from the Pope which forbade rebellion. Soon after, the Jesuit priest Oswald Tezelman had told Garnet that he had taken Catesby's confession. In the course of which he had learned of the plot, Garnet and Catesby met for a third time on July 24th of 1605 at the house of the wealthy Catholic Anne Bow in Enfield Chase. Garnett described that Tesman's account had been given under the seal of the confessional, and that canon law therefore forbade him to repeat what he had heard. Without acknowledging that he was aware of the precise nature of the plot, Garnett attempted to dissuade Catesby from his course to no avail. Garnett wrote to a colleague in Rome, Claudio Acquavia, expressing his concerns about open rebellion in England. He also told Acquavia that there is a risk that some private endeavor may commit treason. Yes, that is going to be something that I might do down the line. I'm gonna name off several videos I'm gonna do within the next couple weeks, and I will let you guys know. And you guys give me some ideas on what you want me to do, and I'll write them down. Now, he also told Acquavia that there is a risk that some private endeavor may commit treason or use force against the king, and urged the Pope to issue a public brief against the use of force. Now, according... on here. I think I had it up here. Let me see. Close that one out. Now, according to Fawkes, 20 barrels of gunpowder were brought in at first, followed by 16 more on July 20th. Now, the supply of gunpowder was theoretically controlled by the government, but it was easily obtained from illicit sources. Now, on July 28th, the ever-present threats of the plague again had delayed the opening of the Parliament, this time until Tuesday, November 5th. Now, Fawkes would leave the country for a short time. The king, meanwhile, spent much of the summer away from the city, hunting. He stayed wherever it was convenient, including on occasion at the houses of prominent Catholics. Garnett, convinced that the threat of an uprising had receded, traveled the country on a pilgrimage. It's not certain when Fawkes would return to England, but he was back in London by late August, when he and Winter discovered that the gunpowder stored in the undercroft had decayed. More gunpowder was brought into the room along with firewood to conceal this. The final 3 conspirators were recruited in late August of 1605. At Michael Moss, Catesby persuaded the staunchly Catholic Ambrose Rookwood to rent Clopton House near Stratford upon Avon, and Rookwood was a young man with recusant connections whose stable of horses at Coldham Hall and Stanningfield, Suffolk, England, was an important factor in his enlistment. Now, his parents, Robert Rookwood and Dorothea Drury, were wealthy landowners and had educated their son at a Jesuit school near Calais. Everard Digby was a young man who was generally well-liked and lived at Gayhurst House in Buckinghamshire. He had been knighted by the king in April of 1603 and was converted to Catholicism by Gerard. Now, Digby and his wife, Mary Moleslaw, had accompanied the priest on his pilgrimage, and the two men were reportedly close friends. Now, Mary Moleslaw had accompanied like I said, okay, so yes, she accompanied him. Digby was asked by Catesby to rent Clopton Court near Alcester, but Digby also promised $1,500 after Percy failed to pay the rent due to the properties he had taken in Westminster. Finally, on October 14th, Catesby invited Francis Tresham into the conspiracy, and Tresham was the son of the Catholic Thomas Tresham and a cousin to Robert Catesby. The two had been raised together. He was also the heir to his father's large fortune, which had been depleted by recusant finds, expensive tastes, and by Francis and Catesby's involvement in the Essex Revolt. Now, Catesby and Tresham met at the home of Tresham's brother-in-law and cousin, Lord Stourton. In his confession, Tresham claimed that he had asked Catesby if the plot would damn their souls, to which Catesby had replied it would not, and that the plight of England's Catholics required that it be done. Catesby also apparently asked for $2,000 and the use of Rushton Hall in Northamptonshire. Tresham declined both offers, although he did give $100 to Thomas Winter and told his interrogators that he had moved his family from Rushton to London in advance of the plot, hardly the actions of a guilty man, he claimed. The details of the gunpowder plot were finalized in October in a series of taverns across London and Daventry. Now, Fawkes would be Fawkes would be left to light the fuse and then escape across the Thames, while simultaneously revolts in the Midlands would help to ensure the capture. Oh yes, I would love to do it. I think I should do a video on William Shakespeare if I haven't already. Shakespeare had some really good stories, and some good stage plays too. Um, Now Fawkes would leave for the continent to explain events in England to the European Catholic powers. Now the wives of those involved and Anne Bow, a friend of Garnet who often shielded priests at her home, became increasingly concerned by what they suspected was about to happen. Now several of the conspirators expressed worries about the safety of fellow Catholics who would be present in Parliament on the day of the planned explosion. Percy was concerned for his patron, Northumberland, and the young Earl of Arundel's name was brought up. Now Catesby suggested that a minor wound would help keep him from the chamber on that day. The Lords Bow, Monteagle, and Stourton were also mentioned. Key suggested warning Lord Mordaunt, his wife's employer, to derision from Catesby. Now, on October 26, a servant delivered a letter for Lord Monteagle to his house in Hoxton, and that they received it from a stranger on the road. And the letter states this: "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care for your preservation. Therefore, I advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time, and think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For there be no any appearance of any stir, yet I say that they shall receive terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be condemned, because it may do you some good, and can do you no harm. For the danger is past as soon as you have burnt that letter, and I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." Now, uncertain of the letter's meaning, Monteagle promptly rode to Whitehall and handed it to Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. Salisbury informed the Earl of Worcester, who was considered to have recusant sympathies, and the suspected Catholic, Henry Howard. That is something I don't know, but this is all stuff that you could think about for yourself. Were the letters written by Guy Fawkes? Were the letters written by some people that they knew? Did the English government forge them? We don't know. Now, and the suspected Catholic Henry Howard, first Earl of Northampton, kept news of the plot from the king, and who was busy hunting in Cambridgeshire and not expected back for several days. Monteagle's servant Thomas Ward had family connections with the Wright brothers, and sent a message to Catesby about the betrayal. Catesby, who had been due to go hunting with the king, suspected that Tresham was responsible for the letter, and with Thomas Winter confronted the recently recruited conspirator, Tresham managed to convince the pair that he had not written the letter, but urged them to abandon the plot. Now, Salisbury was already aware of certain stirrings before he received the letter, but did not yet know the exact nature of the plot or who exactly was involved, and therefore he elected to wait to see how the events would unfold. Now, the letter was shown to the king on the 1st of November following his arrival back in London. Upon reading it, James immediately seized upon the word blow and felt that it hinted at some stratagem of fire and powder, perhaps an explosion or of exceeding in violence, and the one that killed his father, Lord Darnley, at Kirklefield in 1567. He was keen not to seem to intrigue him, and wanting to allow the king to take the credit for unveiling the conspiracy, Salisbury feigned ignorance. The following day, members of the Privy Council had visited the Palace of Whitehall and informed him that, based on the information that Salisbury had given them a week earlier, on Monday, the Lord Chamberlain Thomas Howard, first Earl of Suffolk, would undertake a search for the House of Parliament above and below. On Sunday, November 3rd, Percy, Catesby, and Winter had a final meeting where Percy told his colleagues that they should abide the uttermost trial and remind them of their ship waiting at anchor on the Thames. Now, on November 4th, Digby was ensconced with the hunting party at Dunchurch, ready to abduct Elizabeth the same day. Percy visited the Earl of Northumberland, who was uninvolved in the conspiracy itself, but to see if he could discern what rumors surrounded the letter to Monteagle. Now, Percy would return to London and assured Winter, John Wright, and Robert Keyes that they had nothing to be concerned about, and returned to his lodgings in Gray's Inn Road. That same evening, Catesby, likely accompanied by John Wright and Bates, set off for the Midlands. Fawkes visited Keyes and was given a pocket watch that was left by Percy to time the fuse. And an hour later, Rookwood received several engraved swords from a local cutler. Although two accounts of the number of searches and their timing exist, according to the King's version. The first search of the buildings in and around Parliament was made on November 4th, as the plotters were busy making their final preparations by Suffolk, Monteagle, and John Wynyard. They found a large pile of firewood in the undercroft beneath the House of Lords, accompanied by what they presumed to be a serving man, Fawkes, who told them that the firewood belonged to his master, Thomas Percy, and they left to report their findings, at which time Fawkes also left the building. The mention of Percy's name aroused further suspicion, as he was already known to the authorities as a Catholic agitator. The king insisted that a more thorough search to be taken, and later that night, the search party headed by Thomas Combet returned to the undercrofts. They again found Fawkes dressed in a cloak and hat and wearing boots and spurs. He was arrested, whereupon he gave his name as John Johnston. He was carrying a lantern now held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and a search of his person revealed a pocket watch, several slow watches, and touchwood. 36 barrels of gunpowder were discovered hidden under piles of faggots and coal. Fawkes was taken to the king early on the morning of November 5th. Now, when I talk about the word faggot and the English term, it's not about homosexuality. It's basically in England. If you ask for a fag in England, they will give you either a cigarette or a bundle of sticks. Yes, certain countries just have different meanings for certain things. Okay, so as news of John Johnston's arrest spread among the plotters still in London, most fled northwest along Wetland Street. Christopher Wright and Thomas Percy left together. Rookwood left soon after and managed to cover 30 miles in 2 hours on one horse. He overtook Keyes, who had set off earlier, then Wright and Percy at Little Brickhill before catching Catesby. John Wright and Bates on the same road. Reunited, the group continued northwest to Dunchurch using horses provided by Digby. Yeah, but now if you're in the United States like I am, a fag would be somebody who's gay. But like I said, different countries and states have different meanings for different things. Now, Keyes went to Mordaunt's house at Drayton. Meanwhile, Thomas Winter stayed in London and even went to Westminster to see what was happening. When he realized the plot had been uncovered, he took his horse and made for his sister's house at Norbrook before continuing to Huntington Court. Now the group of the six conspirators stopped at Ashbury St. Ledger's at about 6 p.m., where they met Robert Winter and updated him on their situation. They then continued on to Dunchurch and met with Digby. Catesby convinced him that despite the plot's failure, an armed struggle was still a real possibility. He announced to Digby's hunting party that the king and Salisbury were dead before the fugitives moved west to Warwick. In London, news of the plot was spreading, and the authorities set extra guards on the city gates. They closed the ports and protected the house of the Spanish ambassador, which was surrounded by an angry mob, and the arrest warrant was issued against Thomas Percy, and his patron, the Earl of Northumberland, was placed under house arrest. In John Johnston's initial interrogation, he revealed nothing other than the name of his mother, and that he was from Yorkshire. A letter to Guy Fawkes was discovered in person, but he claimed that name was one of his aliases. Far from denying his intentions, Johnston stated that it had been his purpose to destroy the king and the Parliament. Nevertheless, he maintained his composure and insisted that he had acted alone. His unwillingness to yield so impressed the king that he described him as possessing a Roman resolution. Now, on November 6th, the Lord Chief Justice Sir John Popham, a man with a deep-seated hatred of Catholics, questioned Rookwood's servants. By the evening, he had learned the names of the several of those involved in the conspiracy: Catesby, Rookwood, Keyes, Winter, John, and Christopher Wright, and Grant Johnson. Meanwhile, persisted with his story, and along with the gunpowder that they were found with, was moved to the Tower of London, where the king had decided that Johnson would be tortured. Now, the use of torture was forbidden except by royal prerogative or a body such as the Privy Council or Star Chamber. In a letter of November 6, James wrote, "The gentler tortures are to be first used unto them, and thus by steps extended to the bottom of deaths. And so Godspeed your good work." Johnson may have been placed in manacles and hung from the wall, but he was almost certainly subjected to the horrors of the rack. And when they talk about a torture rack, I'm going to show you it and what it looks like. This picture right here is considered a torture rack. I have never actually. I'm not sure. They would lay you down on it, but I'm not sure what it was supposed to do. On November 7th, his resolve was broken. He confessed later that day and again over the following 2 days. On November 6, with Fawkes maintaining his silence, the fugitives raided Warwick Castle for supplies. Then they continued on to Norbrook to collect weapons. Now from there, they continued their journey to Huntington. Bates left the group and traveled to Causton Court to deliver a letter from Catesby to Garnett and the other priests, informing them of what had transpired and asking for their help in raising an army. Garnett replied by begging Catesby and his followers to stop their wicked actions before himself fleeing. Now several priests set out to Warwick, worried about the fate of their colleagues. They were caught and then imprisoned in London. Catesby and the others arrived at Huntington early in the afternoon, and they were met by Thomas Winter. They received Yeah, that could be. I don't know. I don't know. That could be a thing. And then before himself fleeing, now several priests set out for Warwick, worried about the fate of their colleagues. They were caught and then imprisoned in London. Catesby and the others arrived at Huntington early in the afternoon, and they were met by Thomas Winter. They received practically no support or sympathy from those they met, including family members who were terrified at the prospect of being associated with treason. Now they continued. Now they continued on to Holbeck House on the border of Staffordshire, the home of Stephen Littleton, a member of their ever-deceasing band of followers. Now while there, Stephen Littleton and Thomas Winter went to Pepperhill, the Shropshire resident at Boningale of Robert Winter's father-in-law John Talbot, to gain support, but to no avail. Tired and desperate, they spread out some of the now soaked gunpowder in front of the fire to dry out. Although gunpowder does not explode unless physically contained, a spark from the fire landed on the powder, and the resultant flames engulfed Catesby, Rookwood, Grant, and a man named Morgan, who was a member of the hunting party. Thomas Winter and Littleton, on their way home from Huntington to Holbeck House, were told by a messenger that Catesby had died. At that point, Littleton left, but Thomas arrived at the house to find Catesby alive. Albeit scorched, John Grant was not so lucky and had been blinded by the fire, which he lost his eyesight. Now Digby, Robert Winter and his half-brother John, and Thomas Bates had all left. Of the plotters, only the signs figures of Catesby and Grant, the Wright brothers, Rookwood and Percy, remained. The fugitives resolved to stay in the house and wait for the arrival of the king's men. Now Robert Walsh, Sheriff of Worcester, and his company of 200 men besieged Holbeck House on the morning of November 8th. Thomas Winter was hit in the shoulder while crossing the courtyard, and John Wright was shot, followed by his brother, and then Rookwood. Catesby and Percy were reportedly killed by a single lucky shot. The attackers rushed the property and stripped the dead or dying defenders of their clothing. Grant, Morgan, and Rookwood and Winter were all arrested. Now, Bates and Keyes were captured shortly after Holbeck House was taken. Digby, who had intended to give himself up, was caught by a small group of pursuers. Now Tresham was arrested on November 12th and taken to the Tower 3 3 days later. Now Montague, Mordaunt, and Stourton, Tresham's brother-in-law, were also imprisoned in the Tower. The Earl of Northumberland joined them on November 27th. Meanwhile, the government used a revelation of the plot to accelerate its persecution of Catholics. Now, the home of Anne Bow at Enfield Chase was searched, revealing the presence of trapdoors and hidden passages. A terrified servant then revealed that Garnet, who had often stayed at the house and recently given a mass there, John Gerald, was secreted at the home of Elizabeth Bow and Harold Inn. Bow was taken to London for interrogation, and there she was irresolute. She had never been aware that Gerald was a priest. She had presumed he was a Catholic gentleman, and she did not know of his whereabouts. The homes of the conspirators were searched and looted. Mary Digby's household was ransacked, and she was made destitute. Sometime before the end of November, Garnet moved to Hindlip Hall near Worcester, the home of the Habingtons, where he wrote a letter to the Privy Council protesting his innocence. The foiling of the gunpowder plot initiated a wave of national relief at the delivery of the king and the sons, and inspired in the ensuing Parliament a mood of loyalty and goodwill, which Salisbury astutely exploited to extract higher subsidies for the king than any bar one granted in Elizabeth's reign. Walter Raleigh, who was languishing in the Tower owing to his involvement in the main plot, and whose wife was a first cousin of Lady Catesby, declared that he had no knowledge of the conspiracy. The Bishop of Rochester gave a sermon at St. Paul's Cross in which he condemned the plot. In his speech to both houses on November 9th, James expounded on the two emerging preoccupations of his monarchy: the divine right of kings and the Catholic question. He insisted that the plot had been the work of only a few Catholics, not of the English Catholics as a whole, and he reminded the Assembly to rejoice of his survival, since kings were divinely appointed, and he owed his escape to a miracle. Now Salisbury wrote to his English ambassadors abroad, informing them of what had occurred, and also reminding them that the king bore no ill will to his Catholic neighbors. The foreign powers largely distanced themselves from the plotters, calling them atheists and Protestant heretics. Now, Sir Edward Coke was in charge of the interrogations over a period of about 10 weeks in the lieutenant's lodgings at the Tower of London, now known as the Queen's House. He questioned those who had been implicated in the plot. For the first round of interrogations, no real proof exists that these people were tortured, although on several occasions Salisbury certainly suggested that they should be. Coke later revealed that the threat of torture was in most cases enough to elicit a confession from those caught up in the aftermath of the plot. Only two confessions were printed in full: Fawkes' confession on November 8th and Winter's on November 23rd. Having been involved in the conspiracy from the start, unlike Fawkes, Winter was able to give extremely valuable information to the council. The handwriting on his testimony is almost certainly that of the man himself, but his signature was markedly different. Winter had previously only ever signed his name as such, but his confession is signed Winter, Winter, without the O and the U in there. And since he had been shot in the shoulder, the steady hand used to write the signature may indicate some measure of government interference, or may indicate that writing a shorter version of his name was less painful. Now, Winter's testimony makes no mention of his brother Robert, but both were published in the so-called King's Book, a hastily written official account of the conspiracy, published in late November 1605. Now, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, was in a difficult position. His midday dinner with Thomas Percy on November 4th was damning evidence against him, and after Thomas Percy's death, there was nobody who could either implicate him or clear him of the plot. The Privy Council suspected that Northumberland would have been Princess Elizabeth's protector had the plot succeeded out, but there was insufficient evidence to convict him. Northumberland remained in the Tower, and on November 27th of June June 27th of 1606, was finally charged with contempt of court. He was stripped of all public offices. He was fined about $30,000, which is about $8.3 million in today's money, and kept in the tower until June of 1621. Now the lords Mordaunt and Stourton were tried in the Star Chamber. They were condemned to imprisonment in the Tower, where they remained until 1608, when they were transferred to the Fleet Prison, and both were also given significant fines and were stripped of their powers. Now, several other people not involved in the conspiracy, but known or related to the conspirators, were also questioned. Northumberland's brothers, Sir Alan and Sir Jocelyn Percy, were arrested. Lord Montague had employed Fawkes at an early age and had also met Catesby on October 29th, and was therefore a person of interest. He was released several months later. Agnes Wenman was from a Catholic family and related to Elizabeth Bell. She was examined twice by the charges against her, but were eventually dropped. Percy's secretary and later the controller of Northumberland's household, Dudley Carleton, had released the vault where the gunpowder was stored, and consequently he was imprisoned in the Tower. Salisbury believed his story, and authorized his release eventually. Now, Thomas Bates confessed on December 4th, providing much of the information that Salisbury needed to link the Catholic clergy to the plot. Bates had been present at most of the conspirators' meetings, and under interrogation, he implicated Tesman in the plot. On January 13th of 1606, he described how he had visited Garnet and Tesman on November 7th to inform Garnet of the plot's failure. Bates also told his interrogators of his ride with Tesman to Huntington before the priest left him to head for the habitants at Hindlip Hall, and of a meeting between Garnet, Gerald, and Tesman in October 1605. At about the same time in December, Tressum's health began to deteriorate. He was visited regularly by his wife, a nurse, and his servant, William Vavasor, who documented his strangergy. Before he died, Tressum had also told of Garnet's involvement with the 1603 mission to Spain, but in his last hours, he retracted some of these statements. Nowhere in the confession did he mention the Montego letter. He died early on the morning of December 23rd and was buried somewhere in the Tower. Nevertheless, he was attainted along with the other plotters. His head was set on a pike either by Count's Dipper at Northampton or London Bridge, and his estates were all confiscated. Now, on January 15th, a proclamation named Garnet, Gerald, and Greenway Tesman as wanted men for the plot. Now, Tesman and Gerald escaped the country and lived out their days in freedom, but several days earlier, on January 9th, Robert Winter and Stephen Littleton had been captured, and they'd been hiding at Hagley, the home of Humphrey Littleton, brother of the military police John Littleton. Imprisoned for treason in 1601 for his parts in the Essex Revolt, they were betrayed by a cook who grew suspicious of the amount of food sent up for his master's consumption. Now, Humphrey denied the presence of the two fugitives, but another servant led the authorities to their hiding place. On January 20th, the local justice, the peace, and his retainers arrived at Thomas Habington's home, Hindlip Hall, to arrest the Jesuits. Despite Thomas Habington's protests, the men spent the next 4 days searching the house. On January 24th, starving, the Jesuit lay brothers, Nicholas Owen, who had built the hides at Hindlip, and Ralph Ashley, the servant of Edward Oldcorn, Habington's chaplain, left their hiding place, and they were arrested. Were arrested. Humphrey Littleton, who escaped from the authorities at Hagley, got so far as Prestwood and Staffordshire before he was captured. He was imprisoned and then condemned to death at Worcester on January 26 in an attempt to trade his friends for his life. He told the authorities where they could find Garnet. Worn down by hiding for so long, Garnet, accompanied by Oldcorn, emerged from his priesthold the next day. Now, by coincidence, on the same day that Garnet was found, the surviving conspirators were arraigned in Westminster Hall. Some of the prisoners were taken from the Tower to the Star Chamber by barge. Bates, who was considered lower class, was brought in from the Gatehouse prison. Some of the prisoners were reportedly despondent, but others were nonchalant, even smoking tobacco. The king and his family, hidden from view, were among the many who watched the trial. The Lords Commissioners present were the Earls of Suffolk, Worcester, Northampton, Devonshire, and Salisbury. Sir John Popham was Lord Chief Justice. Sir Thomas Fleming was Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, and two justices, Sir Thomas Walmsley and Sir Peter Warburton, sat as justices of the Common Pleas. The list of traitors' names was read aloud, beginning with the priests Garnet, Tessamond, and Gerald. The first to speak was the Speaker of the House of Commons. They would be named as the Master of the Rolls. Sir Edward Phillips, who described the intent behind the plot in lurid detail. Now he was followed by the Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, or Coke, whatever you want to sell your name, who began with the long speech heavily influenced by Salisbury that included a denial that the king had ever made any promises to the Catholics. Now Monteagle's part in the discovery of the plot was welcomed, and denunciations of the 1603 mission to Spain featured strongly, but Fawkes' protestations that Gerald knew nothing of the plot were omitted from Cook's speech. The foreign powers, when mentioned, were recorded due to respect, but the priests were accursed and their behavior criticized whenever possible. Now, there was little doubt, according to Cook, that the plot had been invented by the Jesuits by Garnet's meeting with Catesby, at which the former was said to have absolved the latter of any blame in the plot, was proof enough that the Jesuits were central to the conspiracy. According to Cook, the gunpowder plot would always have been known as the Jesuit treason, but Coke spoke with a feeling of the probable fate of the Queen and the rest of the king's family, and the innocents who would have been caught up in the explosion. Now, each of the condemned said Cook would be drawn backwards to his death by a horse, his head near the ground. He was to be put to death halfway between heaven and earth, as unworthy of both. The genitals were to be cut off and burnt before his eyes. Man, that would be painful if they had to cut your dick off. I mean, that would be painful enough. Then he would be and then they would be decapitated, which means your head cut off, and the dismembered parts of the body displayed so that they might become prey for the fowls of the air. Confessions. I cannot imagine my dick being chopped off just because I would be a traitor. I'm like, that's painful enough just thinking about that. Now, confessions and declarations from the prisoners were then read aloud, and finally the prisoners were allowed to speak. Now, Rookwood claimed that he had been drawn into the plot by Catesby, whom he loved above any worldly man. Now, Thomas Winter begged to be hanged for himself and his brother, so that his brother might be spared. Now, Fawkes explained his not guilty plea. As ignorant of aspects of the indictment, McKees appeared to accept his fate. Bates and Robert Winter begged for mercy, and Grant explained his involvement as a conspiracy intended but never effected. Only Digby was tried on a separate indictment. He pled guilty, insisting that the king had reneged upon promises of toleration for the Catholics, and that affection for Catesby and love of the Catholic cause mitigated his actions. He sought death by the axe. That's when they chop your head off. That's decapitation. And begged mercy from the king for his young family. His arguments were rebuked by Coke and Northumberland, and along with his 7 co-conspirators, he was found guilty by the jury for high treason. Digby shouted, "If I may, but hear any of your lordship say, 'Forgive me,' I shall go more cheerfully to the gallows." The response was short, "God forgive you, and we do." Now, Garnet may have been questioned on as many as 23 occasions. His response to the threat of the rack was the threats are only for boys, and he denied having encouraged Catholics to pray for the success of a Catholic cause. His interrogators resorted to the forgery of correspondence between Garnet and other Catholics, but to no avail. His jailers then allowed him to talk with another priest in the neighboring cell, with eavesdroppers listening. Eventually, Garnet let slip a crucial detail that there was only one man who could testify that he had any knowledge of the plot. Under torture, Garnet admitted that he had heard of the plot from fellow Jesuit Oswald Tessamond, who had learned of it in a confession from Catesby. Garnet was charged with high treason and tried on the Guildhall on March 28th from 8 a.m. until 7 p.m. According to Coke, Garnet instigated the plot, but Garnet repudiated all the charges against him, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Now, although Catesby and Percy escaped the executioner, their bodies were exhumed and decapitated, and their heads exhibited on pikes outside the House of Lords. On January 30th, Everard Digby, Robert Winter, John Grant, and Thomas Bates were all tied to hurdles or wooden panels and dragged through the crowded streets of London to St. Paul's churchyard. Digby, the first to mount the scaffold, asked the spectators for forgiveness and refused a Protestant clergyman. He was stripped of his clothing and wearing only a shirt, climbed the ladder to place his head through the noose. He was quickly cut down, and while still fully conscious, was castrated, disemboweled, and then quartered along with the three other prisoners. Like I said, that is fucking painful and gruesome to think about back in those days. The following day, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, and Guy Fawkes were all hanged, drawn, and quartered opposite the building that they planned to blow up in the old Palace Yard at Westminster. Keyes did not wait for the hangman's command and jump from the gallows, but he survived the drop and was led to the quartering block. Although weakened by his torture, Fawkes managed to jump from the gallows and break his neck, avoiding the agony of the gruesome latter part of his execution. Stephen Littleton was executed at Stafford. His cousin Humphrey, despite his cooperation, met his end at Red Hill near Worcester, and Henry Garnet was executed on May 3rd of 1606. Now, the discovery of such a wide-ranging conspiracy and the subsequent trials led Parliament to consider new anti-Catholic legislation. The event destroyed all hope that the Spanish would ever secure tolerance of the Catholics in England. In the summer of 1606, laws against recusancy were strengthened. The Popish Recusant Acts returned England to the Elizabethan style of fines and restrictions, introduced a sacramental test and an oath of allegiance, requiring Catholics to abjure as heresy to the doctrine that princes excommunicated by the Pope could be deposed or assassinated. Catholic emancipation took over 200 years, but many important and loyal Catholics retained high enough office during James I's reign. Although there was no golden time of toleration of Catholics, which Garnet had hoped for, James's reign was nevertheless a period of relative leniency for Catholics. The playwright William Shakespeare seems to have featured the events of the Gunpowder Plot alongside the earlier Gowrie conspiracy and Macbeth, written between 1603 and 1607. Interest in the demonic was heightened by the Gunpowder Plot. The king had become engaged in the great debate about other worldly powers, and writing his one book in 1599, and before he became king of England as well as Scotland. Esme, seen in such lines as fair is foul and foul is fair, are used frequently. And another possible reference to the plot relates to the use of equivocation. Garnet's A Treaty of Equivocation was found on one of the plotters. Poets made a point of describing it as an act so evil that not only was it evil, in John Milton's words, but in the English language, the other Neo-Latin poetry used it as an audio show. A guy named Milton wrote a poem in 1606 that one commentator has called a critically vexing poem. In Quintum Novembris, reflecting the partisan public and sentiment on an English Protestant national holiday, in the published editions of 1645 and 1673, the poem is preceded by 5 epigrams on the subject of the Gunpowder Plot, apparently written by Milton in preparation for the larger work. The plot may also have influenced his later work in Paradise Lost. What if the Gunpowder Plot had succeeded? Historian Ronald Huntington concluded that successful implementation of the plot would have prompted a severe backlash against suspected Catholics, and that without foreign assistance, a successful rebellion would have been unlikely, despite differing religious convictions. Most Englishmen were loyal to the monarchy, but England might have become a more Puritan absolute monarchy as such exists in Sweden, Denmark, Saxony, and Prussia in the 17th century, rather than the following path of parliamentary and civil reform that it did bring on. Many at the time felt that Salisbury had been involved in the plot to gain favor with the king and enact more stridently anti-Catholic legislation. Such conspiracy theories alleged that Salisbury had either actually invented the plot or allowed it to continue with his agents, and that they had already infiltrated it for the purposes of propaganda. The Popish plot of 1678 sparked renewed interest in the Gunpowder Plot, resulting in a book by Thomas Barlow, Bishop of Lincoln, which refuted a bold and groundless surmise that all this was a contrivance of Secretary Cecil. Okay, let me write this one down. Popish plot. Oh, shit. Okay, hold on. Okay, put that down there. Ah, shit, bugger. Okay. In 1897, John Gerald of Stonehurst College, namesake of John Gerald, who was following the plot's discovery, had evaded capture, wrote an account called "What Was the Gunpowder Plot?" alleging Salisbury's culpability. This prompted a repudiation later that year by Samuel Gardiner, who argued that Gerald had gone too far in trying to wipe away the reproach which the plot had extracted on generations of English Catholics. Gardiner portrayed Salisbury as guilty of nothing more than opportunism. Subsequent attempts to prove Salisbury's involvement, such as Francis Edwards' 1969 work Guy Fawkes, The Real Story of the Gunpowder Plot, has similarly founded on the lack of any clear evidence. Excuse me. The cellars under the House of Parliament continued to be leased to private individuals until 1678, when news of the Popish plot broke. It was then considered prudent to search the cellars on the day before each state opening of Parliament, a ritual that survives till this day. In January of 1606, during the first sitting of Parliament since the plot, the observance of the November 5th Act of 1605 was passed, making services commemorating the bent and annual future of English life. The Act remained in force until 1859. The tradition of marking the day with the bringing of church bells and bonfires started soon after the plot's discovery, and fireworks were included in some of the earliest celebrations. In Britain, November 5th is variously called Bonfire Night, Fireworks Night, or also known as Guy Fawkes Night. Now, on November 5th, firework displays and bonfire parties are common throughout the whole country of Britain. Traditionally, in the weeks running up to the 5th, children made guys, effigies supposedly of Fawkes, usually made from old clothes, stuffed with newspaper, and fitted with a ghost house mask to be burnt on bonfires. These guys were exhibited to collect money for fireworks, although this custom has become less common now. Now, the word "guy" in the 19th century thus came to mean an oddly dressed person, and in the 20th and 21st centuries, a male person. According to the biographer Esther Forbes, Guy Fawkes' Day in the pre-revolutionary American colonies was a very popular holiday. In Boston, the revelry on Pope Night took on an anti-authoritarian overtone and often became so dangerous that many would not venture out of their homes. And that is the end of our video. I hope you guys enjoyed. For the people that jumped on, now the trolls that are on my channel, they can go fuck they can go fuck themselves or their family members. I know there's a few trolls on here, but today was the story about Guy Fawkes and the assassination attempt on the failed gunpowder plot that he had. Wandering Gamer did mention about the French Revolution. I will talk about that. Other stories I will get to will be the 80 Years' War, pirates, gang members, Africa, Italy. Then we have werewolf, coyote, London, England, Vatican City, which is one I want to get on. Then you have the Ku Klux Klan, which I'd like to get on. There's a whole thing on history, Ice Age, dinosaur, which I love dinosaurs, and Elizabeth Bathory, who was one of the first serial killers to have been. So you got Elizabeth Bathory. She was the first woman to be known as a serial killer outside of besides Vlad the Impaler. So next week I will get to the French Revolution, but not next week. So my next video next week will be on Vatican City, which I love stuff about the Vatican. Even though I'm not Catholic, but obviously they got some good stuff out there. So if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel. Rusty the King. If you want to check out my other channel, RBW King, you're free to check that out too. leave comments. Let me know what you guys think. And if you guys have any suggestions for more videos, be sure to leave them in the comment section, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. And thanks for tuning in.